Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Isolate Your Workspace. Today's webinar is being presented by Hysolate. I'm Marielle Sable, the Marketing Manager here at Hysolate, and I'm going to be your moderator during this webinar. Before I introduce you to our presenter, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping rules. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will be able to share a link with you after the event is complete. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with colleagues. We also invite your comments and questions. Please look at the Q&A chat box on your screen. If you think of a question for the speaker at any point, just type it in there and I will either pose it to our speaker at the time or hold it for the discussion portion at the end of the presentation. We have all attendees automatically muted during the session. Today's presenter is Hysolate CEO, Marc Gaffan. Marc is a successful CEO, entrepreneur, and cybersecurity veteran. Prior to joining Hysolate, Marc was the Chief Business Officer at Nexar, where he led sales, marketing, biz dev, customer success, and field operations. In 2009, Marc co-founded Encapsula, and after its acquisition by Imperva, led the Encapsula team as CEO to 100 million in run rate, protecting millions of websites worldwide and many of the world's largest enterprises and telcos. Marc is a thought leader and has appeared before the U.S. Congress, FDIC, and Federal Trade Commission on cybersecurity and identity theft topics. He holds an MBA and a BSc in computer science and economics from Tel Aviv University. Marc, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Mariel, and welcome everyone, regardless of where you are and what time zone you're in. And as Mariel said, today we're going to talk about isolated workspace as a service. This is Hysolate's offering. And to kick off, I'm going to start off by talking about the problem or the challenge that Hysolate's trying to solve. And we call this challenge essentially the endpoint security dilemma. The endpoint security dilemma essentially is how do we balance between, first of all, the fact that the security on our endpoints is becoming even more and more challenging, with 70% of breaches today happening on the endpoint. Patch Tuesday is something that you all know about, and daily critical application vulnerabilities being discovered. And this challenge is becoming even more acute now with so many people working remotely, essentially outside of the corporate firewall, that it's really up to us and our endpoints or our desktops and our laptops to thwart the attackers. The second challenge that we're trying to address essentially is user productivity. And user productivity is definitely, or employee productivity is going to be one of the key topics that we believe organizations are going to be discussing in the years to come due to the fact that our work habits have changed so dramatically. And more users need to be productive remotely on their endpoints, with more and more organizations trying to deal with some of the security challenges by blocking and preventing users from doing certain things that could pose risks. At the other hand, they're also limiting productivity and inhibiting the users or employees to perform their jobs. And of course, there's always the cost function. How do we keep our total cost of ownership per employee or per user down? How do we deal with all the exception handling of, can you please open up this website for me, or could you please let me install this type of application? These are all the exception handlings that IT organizations are facing today. And the question is, how sustainable is that at a large scale, especially with us all working remotely? In a recent poll that we did together with teammates across 70 CISOs from Fortune 2000 companies, 62% of the CISOs told us that they restrict web browsing. So employees can't browse on their corporate devices to everywhere they want to. They're locked down in a certain way. 70% of them told us that they restrict installing third-party applications. And some of these third-party applications include, web conferencing, collaboration. Typically, collaboration tools are the nightmares of the security guys, because those are great means to contracting malware, incoming content, but also a way to exfiltrate data outside of the organization. But more and more people need these type of applications today in order to be productive. 80%, so 4 out of 5 organizations today don't grant admin rights to the users, which means that many applications that they need to do their jobs, they can't install. This is also getting significantly worse with people working from home, and these numbers from a recent AT&T report reveal that 35% of employees are using the same device for both their personal and their work activities. 24%, almost a quarter, are sharing or storing sensitive information in unsanctioned cloud applications through different types of applications. And 18% are sharing their work device with another family member. I can tell you personally, I've spoken to people who are in the security space that have given in to their kids who wanted to install something on their endpoint because for the sake of peace at home, we do lots of things, often compromising corporate security. More and more employees are going to be demanding what we're calling IT freedom. And 80% or 82% of remote workers believe that they'll never return to a physical office setting the way they did before. So there'll be some type of remote work combined with some office work. But what that means is that we'll be spending lots and lots of time outside our corporate firewalls with all the security measures that we have in those environments, and a lot is going to depend on our endpoint and how we can provide this functionality or this productivity and security on our endpoint. What Hysolate is enabling organizations to do essentially is create isolated workspace on corporate and also non-corporate endpoints literally in minutes and manage them directly from the cloud in a very, very simple way. This isolated workspace as a service provides strong VM-based isolation. So this additional environment, this additional workspace is running in a strong virtualized and isolated environment. You don't have to install or manage an additional operating system. So we've got a very unique technique in which we essentially can fork the operating system binaries on the fly and create an instant isolated environment without you having to operate or manage another ISO, another operating system with all the patch management and the overhead associated with it. It's deployable in minutes to thousands of devices, so it can be deployed at mass. And of course, versus some other technologies such as VDI or desktop as a service, there's no data center costs or no backhauling of the data. This is all running locally on the end user's device, but is strongly isolated from anything else. This virtualization-based security essentially gives us lots of functionality with controlling and managing this workspace or this environment on the user's endpoint. You can create robust networking rules. So for example, you can determine what that workspace or that environment can connect to, if it's a certain firewall or if it's a certain VPN or gateway solution. You can create fine-grained clipboard controls on what is allowed to be copied and pasted from that environment onto your host environment, including different policies regarding to images, to text, and to files. You can determine whether the USB ports will be available to that workspace, whether the webcam will work, whether you'll be able to print on the printers that are available on that PC, so that you can really gain fine-grained controls over data leakage. All the data associated with the virtual environment is encrypted using BitLocker. And of course, when an organization wants to lock this environment or completely wipe it off the user's endpoint, they can do so by accessing by pressing a button essentially, or issuing a command essentially through the Hysolate management console that will wipe or lock the device. And of course, we've invested significantly in hardening this environment so that keystroke capturing and injection would be prevented, and anti-tampering mechanisms for the underlying operating system have also been put in place to make sure that when this environment is spun up and created literally in minutes, it's completely clean, it's been signed by the same provider of the operating system, and there's no vulnerabilities or files have been swapped in them to ensure its integrity. From an end user experience perspective, the goal was to create a really simple and intuitive extension essentially of the user's workstation. The environment is this additional environment is implemented as a separate virtual desktop. The entire user experience, and I'll demo this for you guys in just a moment, is consistent with the user's primary environment. So the time, the language, regional settings, fonts, resolutions has all been synced up to their primary environment. So when they make a change on their primary environment in their additional virtualized workspace, it takes effect as well. We've also implemented different customizations in terms of the look and feel of that workspace, in terms of folder settings and start menu. So again, it doesn't look like a full-blown operating system. It looks literally like an additional desktop or workspace in which the user can do additional activities. And of course, we can pre-bundle applications into this environment so the user doesn't have to install anything, and it comes essentially out of the box with different applications that they need to perform within this environment. From a deployment perspective, we spoke about some of this earlier, but the endpoint deployment is done through a lightweight, literally a 200 meg installer that you can either provision through the Hysolate management server, or you can push it out like you push out any other software on your corporate networks through an SCCM or an Intune or something like that. And again, you don't need to bring an operating system or an image to enable this entire virtualized environment. That's our secret sauce in being able to spin up this virtualized environment using the existing binaries of the operating system. It supports any Windows 10 operating system, whether it's Home, Pro, or Enterprise editions. It will soon support Mac as well, with really basic hardware requirements, 8 gigs of RAM, and basically a BIOS that lets you run virtualization. This typically is available on any PC that was acquired over the last 3 or 4 years. So the bulk of corporate and even non-corporate devices out there will be compatible with it. From a management perspective, it's all managed from the Hysolate SaaS management platform. All the endpoints are fully managed from this multi-tenant environment. You can deploy this in minutes without installing any backend infrastructure. The provisioning is done remotely, again, through this quick installer of 200 megs that will integrate, even if you need to, with your Azure Active Directory or other identity provider services that you may need. You can easily bundle applications or software into this environment, so it comes pre-installed with all the tools that the users need in that environment. And you can provide them, you have full control on the policies that I just mentioned earlier, all from a remote management platform. Before we go into all the use cases, let me stop the presentation for just a moment and show you what this actually looks like. I'm presenting to you from a Hysolate workstation. And if this is my corporate environment that you can see here, I have another environment, which is my Hysolate workspace, that I can flip over to the excuse me, guys, for 1 second. There you go. No more messages will interfere. I can flip between these environments literally with a keystroke. So using a hotkey on my keyboard, I can move between my virtual Hysolate workspace, which is this red world, and my typical blue corporate world. And as you can see, the time, the clock, the font, everything is being synced. The file system in this environment has been essentially customized not to show me a full C drive, but just all my friendly folders that I need in terms of downloads or my works or my my desktop or my documents. This is a working environment essentially. But it goes beyond just having 2 separate environments, because they're essentially integrated from a workflow perspective. Because if I, for example, try and launch a certain website, let's say I'm trying to go to CNN.com, and CNN.com has been blocked by my corporate proxy because my employer doesn't want me going to that website on my corporate environment, the system automatically redirected me into my other isolated environment, and it opened up there. That means that all the non-sanctioned websites that my employee, my enterprise doesn't allow me to access, I will be able to access in an isolated environment without harming my corporate posture, essentially, or my corporate security posture. Same goes with files. My employee, or based on the policy, can determine that, for example, if I try and open up PDF files, I'm not allowed to open them in my corporate environment. And it will say, hey, you're not allowed to open this in that environment. Do you want to transfer it? I'll click transfer, and immediately the files copied over seamlessly through the Hysolate agent, essentially, into this environment, and opens up and launches the PDF. So these environments are essentially integrated from a workflow perspective, and all these workflows are determined by the administration or the IT and security team that can determine what you're allowed to do in each of these environments and what you're not allowed to do, including networking, and I'll show you some of those capabilities as well. As I mentioned earlier, this is all driven off a management server. So you can see what we can do from a policy perspective. We have different policies around transfer policies, copying and pasting. Here's an example of how you set different policies of being able to copy content from the primary environment to the workspace and vice versa, from the workspace to the primary environment. You can enable this for files, for text, for images, and create different policies for them. Same goes for connecting external devices. You can determine whether USB drives are allowed, different types of these, as I mentioned earlier, whether a webcam is enabled or not, printing on the workspace. You can create different networking policies. So you can literally create firewall rules. By adding new rules, you can essentially, determine what they can connect to, what the protocol is, destination, literally like you create firewall rules. And by that, confine the workspace to only connect to environments or to networking areas that you want to connect them to. Different security policies, application policies. This is where you can pre-bundle applications into this environment. And once you create all these policies, you essentially create baselines by taking all these policies and combining them into what we call baseline, which is an aggregation of different policies. And then you go and assign these policies to different users. Each user in the organization can have a completely different policy, although you can obviously use groups, and you can use your identity provider tagging in order to assign those groups to different users. This is the way you essentially control the policy of how Workspace works in the context of a corporate application. So in terms of the use cases, I would say there are three primary use cases in which organizations use Hysolate. The first is for enabling BYOD. So how do you create isolated environments on non-corporate devices to enable employees, third parties to securely access corporate applications and data from an unmanaged non-corporate device? The second one is on corporate managed devices, and this is more of what I showed you in terms of my own demo, to allow employees to browse the web, install applications, download files in an isolated environment without them compromising corporate security, and doing so in a safe way. And the third use case is Hysolate for privileged access. These are the high sensitive tasks that employees in the organizations need to do. You can provide them essentially with an isolated, clean environment, a sterile environment, essentially, for them to be able to do these high risk activities from a clean environment on the same endpoint in which they do their everyday types of activities. In the BYOD scenario, this is typically, as I mentioned earlier, for unmanaged devices. These could be work from home employees that have been, that want to use a personal device because they don't have a corporate device. These could be remote franchises that have purchased their own hardware and devices that need to access the corporate systems. It could be third parties. So I could be a contractor working for another company, and I want to use my device with the company that I'm providing services to. I can do so by the company that I'm trying to provide services to dropping this environment essentially on my other corporate device or my corporate device and managing that environment in a way that they deem fit versus giving them access from my corporate environment. Same goes for subsidiary management or M&A integrations. Assume that you've just acquired a company and now you need to integrate the IT fabrics of these two organizations. This will take months, sometimes years. One way to do it is to essentially create an isolated environment on the target's devices, all the employees from the company that was just acquired, and give them access from that environment essentially into the acquirer's systems that they want to make available. This is what it essentially would look like. This would be my unmanaged device in which I've got, all my either personal or corporate applications running in it. And on top of it, you'd have this isolated bubble or this isolated operating system in which I would be able to access all the corporate applications either through a VPN or maybe a zero trust type of architecture. I'd have all my security stack running in it. And all this would be running on the Hysolate platform driven by this agent that's present on the device. And it's all controlled by the Hysolate cloud policy. In this case, we'd not give the users admin rights. We'd pre-install all the applications that we need in this environment to be made available. We would prevent any copying of data to and from this environment to prevent any type of data exfiltration and infection in terms of malware. We disallow USB drives to, again, lock this environment down as much as possible. And if we needed to remotely wipe this entire environment because we have suspended or terminated the relationship with this third party that is using their own device, with a click of the button in the management server that you just saw earlier on, you can totally make this environment go away, leaving nothing on the endpoint in terms of data or anything like that. The other use case that I spoke about is how to use Hysolate on corporate managed devices. And these are knowledge workers that need to browse the web freely, install applications. These could be what we call road warriors, travelers that are moving in and out Wi-Fi networks on an ongoing basis for those of us that can still travel. Researchers that really need to install applications. They need to go into the dark web, download content. Developers that are downloading snippets and SDKs and need to explore, and they don't have admin rights on their devices. And even customer support agents, or in general customer-facing employees that receive content from end users or from individuals. That user-generated content could essentially either detonate from a security perspective, so they could potentially be sending malware into the organization, and we don't want that malware essentially detonating in the corporate environment. So it could, if it's received in the workspace, in the isolated environment, it would essentially be isolated in that world and wouldn't be able to propagate into the corporate environment. But even if that customer support agent received some personal data, some PII, that's not necessarily required to do their job, but the end user sent it. If at the end of the day, that entire environment is wiped because it was defined as a non-persistent environment, the organization is not retaining any unnecessary data and not creating any type of liability. And by doing that, they're essentially reducing their data liability footprint significantly. This is the way it would essentially look. This is a reverse situation here, in which you would typically have a restricted corporate operating system. This is my blue world here with all your corporate email. You'd have all your security measures on it. It would be connected to the corporate network, on top of which you'd have this isolated workspace in which the user could install different applications that they needed in terms of productivity, file sharing, maybe communication. And even if they wanted to watch Netflix, this is all done in an environment that if they did contain or contract malware, it's stuck in this virtual environment and cannot break out into the restricted corporate operating system. And the third use case that I mentioned is Hysolate for privileged access. This is essentially an ability to perform high-risk activities in a separate and isolated environment. Typically, you'd see the IT admins using this, the DevOps or security operations teams using this either as a clean jump box, or if this was a security or a researcher, they could use this environment as a sandbox in order to detonate malware if they wanted to try. For financial services, these could be isolated environments in which they can perform payments from a clean environment, and by that completely segregate their payment system from their day-to-day or their business as usual environments. And even in OT or OCS production plants, create two separate environments, one to touch the OT network and one to do your business as usual or your typical IT activities. And this is essentially how this use case would play out. On your lockdown host, you'd have all your high sensitive activities. You'd be able to access your Active Directory or your cloud infrastructure or your SCADA system. And on top of that, you'd have a corporate local virtual environment in which you do your typical corporate stuff. And these environments are completely separate. They connect to different network segments. So the IT and OT environments are totally separate from each other and can prevent cross-contamination. So to summarize, before we open up the floor to questions, the solution that we provide essentially creates a strong, virtualized, OS isolated environment that is native from a user experience perspective and very, very easy and rapid to deploy at scale from the cloud, and literally can be deployed to thousands of endpoints in a matter of minutes with very little overhead from an organization's perspective. Thanks, and Mariel, let's open up now for any questions that have come across during the session.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Marc, for giving us that in-depth look at the Hysolate solution. We do have a few questions that came in from our viewers during the presentation. The first is, will we see how the Hysolate environment is created and distributed?
So I didn't demo it specifically, but I can talk to it very, very simply. So there's two ways essentially of creating or distributing the Hysolate environment. As I mentioned, it's distributed through a light 200 meg agent, which can either be pushed out through your typical distribution mechanism like an SCCM, like I mentioned earlier, and this would be pushed to the end user. The user would essentially, and I can show you what this would look like from an end user perspective. They'd have their Hysolate management in which they would be able to log into this environment and launch the agent. They've got a guide in it. They would be able to reset this environment or troubleshoot if they need to. The admin can remotely troubleshoot this as well. So that's the way you would typically deploy the endpoint. Now, in terms of the credentials or the login environment, you could either provision them with credentials through the Hysolate management system. So we would create those credentials and they would log in. Or if you integrated with your identity provider with the management server, they could essentially use their corporate ID with regardless of what you're using, as long as you're using any type of SAML protocol or as long as your IDP, your identity provider, supports SAML, you'll be able to integrate with us and we'll be able to use their credentials and all the tagging and the attributes associated with those individuals in order to provision them with the right type of policy when they signed into the Hysolate workspace. I hope that answered the question.
Awesome. We've got a bunch more questions here for you. So next is, how many VMs can be deployed on one desktop?
So at the moment, only one, but there's no real limitation from a technology perspective. This is something that we will be introducing in the future. Obviously, the more virtual environments you provision, you do want to have a stronger machine, but on the other hand, we've got capabilities that essentially when a VM is not active or not being used and you're not literally in focus, we will essentially pause it so it won't consume much resources, and this will enable running multiple or more than one environments in the future.
Awesome. The next question is, if a company uses Hysolate, do they need to also install antivirus, EDR, DLP, etc.?
So that's a great question, and it really depends on the use case that they're trying to achieve, and what they're running in the virtualized workspace and what they're running on their host. If you're providing, for example, if you're using the workspace for what we call the corporate device as a green lane, essentially an area or a zone in which users can do some of the things that you don't want them doing in your corporate environment, such as browsing and downloading applications, you may not necessarily want to install your EDR. Maybe just a basic AV, from Microsoft is good enough, because anything they do there essentially is contained in that environment. So it's really up to you. If you're deploying the workspace on a non-corporate device, you do probably want to have some type of control, but that's, you know, because you want to make sure that that area in which they're now accessing your corporate network is protected. So it very much depends on the use case, and of course, our customers, you know, consult with us on what are best practices. We've deployed this, you know, enough times to be able to provide that type of guidance.
Great. The next question we have is, so what about Mac? If it's a BYOD scenario, are you assuming those user-owned devices are also all Windows?
So that's a good question. So Mac currently is not supported, but will be supported at the end of Q4 going into Q1. And all the functionality that I just mentioned now in terms of all the controls will enable you essentially to run a Windows version on top of Mac and control it in the exact same manner in which I just mentioned earlier. So Mac's on the roadmap, on the short-term roadmap, will be GA'd in Q1.
Great. Is the Hysolate solution compatible with features like Cred Guard, Device Guard, etc.?
So it's definitely compatible. There's certain things that those features do that are similar in terms of containment, but what we're trying to do here is at a much broader scale of not just containing a single application, but also, you know, creating an entirely separate environment, not just at the application level, but something that's a lot more consistent or robust for the end users to have an entire working experience, more than some of those built-in capabilities essentially within Microsoft or within Windows. Great.
Can a single device handle multiple isolated environments or only a single one?
Yeah, so we answered that earlier, Meryl. At the moment, just one environment, but very soon we'll be able to run multiple environments as well.
Great. In a pause scenario, can the isolated environment resist against an attacker controlling with an RAT, the regular device?
Wow, I'm not sure I understood that question. You mind repeating it?
Yep. In a pause scenario, can the isolated environment resist against an attacker controlling the regular device?
So now I get it. So if you're running a POI, privileged access workstation scenario, in which you're essentially, you've locked down your host or your regular environment and you're running a less restricted environment within the workspace, then in theory, if an attacker got onto the host, they could break into the VM. I would say it's very, very difficult. We've had pen testers run 50 plus of the most common malware stacks out there. They haven't been able to break into the VM. They haven't been able to exploit data. So things are possible. At the end of the day, we're talking about software, but we're raising the bar significantly here by creating this isolated environments and all these anti-tampering and unhardening mechanisms that we've put into place to prevent this from happening.
The next question is, what is the performance profile for the isolated environment? Can it be used for development tasks, something like using VS Code comfortably?
Yes, so the performance is really, really good. One of the things that we're doing here is we're using the native Windows 10 Hyper-V as the hypervisor layer. And we've, of course, wrapped it around with the container technology that we're using and we're leveraging. So the performance is very, very optimized. The sharing of resources between what's running on the host and the VM are very efficient. You can dynamically allocate resources to the VM versus the host, and you'll see very good performance compared to other virtualization environments that you typically see in the past.
Great. I have a follow-up question to one of the previous questions that just came through. So did this attendee understand correctly? that the PAW runs in the isolated environment, not on the host?
So that depends, and we've seen different organizations implement a PAW architecture in two different ways. One is which the host is essentially the sterile, not isolated, but the very, very locked down environment that's very, very restricted. And the virtual environment is the more permissive one for the everyday use or for the more risky activities. But we've also seen organizations deploy this in the other way around, in which they keep their host the way it is, and they only provide access to the privileged systems from the isolated workspace. A lot of what determines that is the starting point for that organization. Often, if they have already implemented a PAW program, but the side effects of a PAW program are often the frustration of the users of the privileged access workstations, in the sense that they're very, very locked down. There's a lot of things they need to do, and creating a workspace, an isolated workspace on that environment, gives them that green lane, that window of productivity in which they can do the things that they would never be granted access to or rights to be doing on their lockdown device. So this is their jailbreak, or their sanctioned jailbreak. If an organization doesn't have a PAW program in place, and they're trying to implement some type of a elevated security environment for accessing their corporate or their high sensitive systems, then often they'll do that from that isolated workspace, because they don't need to change anything on their host. All they need to do is launch or deploy Hysolate on that device, and then limit access to those sensitive systems only from the workspace, which we can implement through different types of health checks and things like that.
Great. The next question we have is, what is the taxing of the VM on performance and response times on the average installation?
So typically, you'd see the VM consume about 2 gigs of RAM, and you'd probably see about a 10 to 12% hit on your CPU. That's essentially the overhead of what this environment essentially creates. And then, of course, it depends on what you're running in each of these environments, what you're running on your host and what you're running in the VM. But that's typically what you'll see from a performance perspective.
Great. The next question we have is, I'm trying to understand the technology in comparison to something like Citrix or VMware. What is there at the back end of the Hysolate environment? How are isolated environments stored, on the client or on a back-end server?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's important that we get that clear. So everything related to Hysolate runs on the endpoint itself. It's very different to a Citrix or a VDI virtual desktop or a desktop as a service provider like Microsoft or like VMware. Everything is local. That means that the end user experience is a local end user experience. It's literally a native experience. There's no latency. There's no moving the mouse and waiting for a couple of milliseconds to see the reaction that's typically associated with a virtual desktop environment. You can work when you're offline as well. You don't have to be online. And then there's the cost factor. VDI or virtual desktoping is often a very expensive solution, because you're paying for the VDI solution, you're paying additional Microsoft licenses, and you're paying for the cloud or the backhauling of the data to and fro the data center, and the workload, running those workloads in the data center is very, very costly. The other thing that we're hearing from more and more customers is that VDI was a great solution for them when they had many of their applications running essentially in the data center. So what they did is they had their desktops very close to their applications, and users would remotely access those desktops. Today, more and more of our corporate applications are actually running in the public cloud. Office 365, G Suite, Salesforce, SAP, all of those applications are now delivered as a SaaS service, And it's starting to make little sense in accessing those applications, these applications essentially through a proxy or a conduit that's in the cloud somewhere. So it makes little sense for me on my endpoint sitting at home to access my virtual desktop that's sitting in a data center somewhere, for that desktop to then access a third-party cloud service, all the data to be rendered to that desktop, then down to my own laptop. That doesn't make sense anymore. We should be accessing all these cloud services directly from our endpoints in a secure way with the data governance and containment capabilities, but we shouldn't be going through an additional desktop somewhere in the cloud because the performance, the cost is just not, was not designed for those type of architectures. And there's nothing involved in terms of servers or backend or anything like that. The entire cost from a total cost of ownership perspective for the customer is the Hysolate software license. There's no additional costs whatsoever. The servers deployed in our multi-tenant environment, you get that as part of the deal. And of course, you don't need to buy any additional operating system licenses or anything like that.
As a follow-up question, so there is nothing involved in terms of servers other than distribution.
Yes, correct. That's what I just answered.
Great. So our last question here is, can you Docker run inside Hysolate?
So I believe that you can, and I do believe that we can support nested virtualization. And if we can't right now, I've definitely heard that term internally, and forgive me whoever answered the question. I believe that we can do it, and if you want a final answer, I'm sure we'd be happy to follow up with you after the webinar and provide you with a concrete answer on that, and if it's not available right now, on when it's coming. It's definitely something that the developers need, because they're using a lot of container technology, and that's something that we do intend, if it's not already supported natively within Hyper-V. I do believe, as I said earlier, that it is already provided and supported.
Great, thank you. And we just got 2 more questions come in here. Maybe 3. Is this technology based on an existing technology like Hyper-V, VirtualBox, etc., or did you create your own technology?
So the hypervisor that we're using is Hyper-V, but the entire system around spinning it up instantly, forking the operating system, is something that we've architectured based on some building blocks that obviously exist in Windows 10. But this is our architecture on how to essentially create an entire system out of the building blocks that are provided on the endpoint, of course, with all the management capabilities that are in the cloud and all the hardening capabilities that we've built into this to make sure that it's not just functional, but also very, very secure.
Great. The next question is, can we configure Hysolate hard drive size, CPU size, and RAM size? Is it possible to log collection for theme from Hysolate isolated systems?
So the answer to both of those questions is yes. You can configure, or you can create guardrails or max thresholds for the hypervisor in how much resources it can consume. And we do provide logging of all the interactions essentially between the workspace and the host. And those can be exported or sent directly to your SIM, your security information event management system. Absolutely.
Great. We just got a couple more questions here. So, will my security tools follow the deployment of Hysolate, such as such as antivirus?
Yes, so you can install your antivirus, your AV in the workspace, just as you would install it on the host operating system.
Great. Another question here is, this may be a bit crazy, but could you use OneDrive as a distribution mechanism?
So I don't really see the point in using OneDrive? I mean, at the end of the day, OneDrive is just a file sharing mechanism. At the end of the day, in order to distribute the software, you've got to download a 200 meg agent. It's the same way as you would install Zoom on your endpoint. You'd either have the user download it from a website, you'd send them a link in an email, or you could, as I said earlier, you could push it through their endpoint through your software distribution mechanisms like an Intune or an SCCM. So again, any way you can get the executable, the installer onto the user's endpoint is valid, and different organizations will do it in different ways.
Great. So I think that was all of the questions that have come up so far in the chat and in the Q&A box. So thank you everyone so much for submitting those questions. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, and a big thank you to Marc for sharing your insights and expertise. If you have any additional questions or you'd like to connect directly with us here at Hysolate, you can reach out to me, Marielle Sable, at marielle@hysolate.com, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with the appropriate person. Thank you so much for your time, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Mariel, thank you for setting this up and hosting it, and thanks everyone for attending. And as Mariel said, if you need anything, you know where to find us on the website, or directly contacting Mariel or myself directly. That will work well as well. Thanks.